Would you rather have your decisions made by unelected judges or unelected bureaucrats? Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, a fascinating case at the Supreme Court today. Associate Justice Clarence Thomas essentially reversed himself from a 2005 case and was trying to convince his colleagues that they should take on a new case known as Howard Baldwin versus the U.S. because it would give them an opportunity to reevaluate two decisions in the past that he thinks are now misplaced and perhaps unconstitutional. Those decisions in the past, the 2005 Brand X decision, which he wrote the court's 6-3 majority opinion in, and then the previous decision to that, 1984 Chevron decision. Without going too deeply into the weeds, Bill, Chevron basically says that the court's precedent is to defer to government agencies when Congress is vague. So if they have to interpret a statute and an agency like the FCC has interpreted that statute, they would tend to defer to the federal agency. The Brand X decision took that even further, and it gets rather complicated. But basically, I want to read a description of it here. And Clarence Thomas now says that Brand X appears to be inconsistent with the Constitution because it basically gives the agency the power to interpret something after a court has already done so, and to write something after a court has already said that you can't interpret it that way. So essentially turning the courts into advisory organizations rather than giving them the power to rule on something. Now, Bill, I know in advance that you're probably not going to like the idea of either groups of unelected individuals making these decisions. But what do you think of a Supreme Court justice publicly saying, hey, look, in hindsight, I made a mistake in 2005, and we need to take this case up again to reevaluate my previous ruling?
Well, first of all, to answer your question, I would by far rather have unelected judges make decisions for me than unelected agencies. By far.
Why? Why would that be?
Well, because first of all, a judge is an individual and a court is a series of individuals. There are people there who, on some level, if they may at least not, you may not be able to influence the vote, but at least you know who's doing it. An agency is a non-entity. It's a collection of bureaucrats that has no general purpose other than its own self-perpetuation. And I can't imagine that I don't, off the top of my head, can't think of a worse entity to make a decision than a bunch of bureaucrats. Judges, presumably, and you say that you said that you're unelected official. Which unelected would you prefer, the judge or the agency? Agencies, without question, are unelected. But judges certainly are not. I mean, judges are elected even at the very lowest level are elected by the people. So I'm going to come down with the judges on that one.
Well, and I think you could look at that both ways. Judges at, for example, the county level is certainly they hold elections for judges. Federal court judges are nominated and then approved by the Senate or with the advice and consent of the Senate, as the Constitution would put it. But it's an interesting situation here because basically the Supreme Court could not come up with 4 votes to take up this case that would have reevaluated 2 of their previous precedents. And normally, that's how they've maintained stability throughout the years. I mean, despite the fact that a lot of conservatives and frankly a lot of liberals think the court has swung wildly, the court has actually been fairly stable over the decades because of this ruling, this precedent reverence of stare decisis, which has let that previous decision stand.
Well, precedence in law is important, and the reason it carries the weight that it carries is because basically it's because of heuristics. Once you learn something, you can build upon that knowledge. You don't have to go back and relearn every single thing you do every day. The classic example is if I touch something that's red hot and burn myself, next time I see something glow in red, chances are pretty good I don't have to actually touch it to find out it's hot. I've already learned that lesson and I can build upon that. So precedence is important because it cuts so much of the overall clutter of total decisions that need to be made. If a decision, I'm simplifying, needless to say, but if somebody decides that as a culture that murder is bad, that's not something we have to discuss every single time. There is a precedent for this. This is the idea, I suspect, behind precedents. I'm certainly not a lawyer, although I occasionally play one on the internet. The idea of precedents has weight, and I think the balance is more or less correct. Precedent should have weight, but precedence is not law, and precedence is not necessarily wisdom. Previous decisions can be wrong, and furthermore, times can change to the degree that a decision that might have looked good in 2005 doesn't look so good today. One of the things that is so alarming to so many Americans who have respect for the rule of law and the Constitution is this so-called deep state. And when I say so-called, I'm not saying that because I don't believe in it. I'm saying that because I don't really know what else to call it. It's not a good term for it, really. It is a perpetual bureaucracy. It's like a multicellular organism where each cell is an agency, and it's a monster. And the more complex it gets, the more dangerous it becomes. When you're dealing with something like agencies and agencies overriding courts, you're basically allowing a system. This actually may be starting to help me be a little clearer on this one. A judge will make a decision, and the judge will factor in whatever he needs to factor in. And sometimes it'd be a good decision, sometimes a bad decision, but somebody's using reason, and somebody is at least, at the very, very, very least, an individual person is weighing a choice and coming to a decision based on their own lights. An agency is composed of thousands of little tiny pieces of input from thousands of different people that make up the agency, but there's no controlling morality to it. There's no built-in reason to it. There's no one weighing things. An agency is a group of anonymous people that are making small-scale decisions that by sheer mathematics end up turning into large-scale decisions, and I think that's far more dangerous. One could argue the same
thing about Congress, for that matter, Bill. And I'm not saying this to be combative at all. It's just, congressmen come and go, but in many cases, it's the same staffers that persist on Capitol Hill for years, if not decades. Well,
this is the problem. If you, to the degree you want to talk about Congress being an agency, that's true. But the job of that particular agency is, in fact, to make political decisions. And more importantly than that, whether it does a better job than a random agency, I'm not sure. I don't have a tremendous amount of undying, breathless awe for the wisdom of Congress. I certainly have a lot more respect for the people that send it there. But at the very, 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 very least, the one thing you can say about Congress as an agency is you know who is in it and you know how they vote. There is some degree of accountability. If there's accountability, then there can be correction. If I know who's making these decisions and I know what the decisions are and I know how they're made in sequence, I may not have had anything to do with the selection of those people, but certainly at the very least, I can lead the brigade of enraged peasants with pitchforks and torches, knowing that this is the person or these are the people that together made that decision. When we talk about agencies and bureaucracies, we're talking about entities that not only have no moral focus because there's no moral actor involved. Its output is a collection of thousands of individual decisions where no one's really taking it in the direction it needs to go. But more importantly than that, the agency essentially there is no recourse. You don't know who made the decisions. So I would much rather be subject to a court that I had no control over than an agency that I had no control over, if for no other reason, then at least at the end of the day, I know who I can throw rocks at in the backyard in the privacy of my own home. I've got some idea of who's doing this to me.
There's a press release that came out of a group called the New Civil Liberties Alliance applauding Clarence Thomas for his impassioned plea, asking the court to take up this case, which they did not. But the NCLA, how is it? Yes, NCLA says that that the Brand X decision, which again Clarence Thomas wrote in 2005, says that federal courts must defer to federal agencies' reasonable statutory interpretations, even when those interpretations contradict a previous court ruling interpreting the same statute, and even when those agencies' regulations were written subsequent to the court's interpretation. This, Clarence Thomas referred to today, as he says, this has taken this court to the precipice of administrative absolutism.
Well, you know what I hear there? I hear the sound of reason, wisdom, and humility. The first thought that came into my mind when you were just telling me this about what he thought about his earlier decision, I can tell you exactly how I felt about it. Honestly, it just flew right into my head. To me, this is the sound you hear when your jet aircraft is about to land at an airport and everybody's just snuggled in, comfortable, ready to go, and just a few seconds away from touchdown. And this is the feeling I get when all of a sudden I hear the jet engines come spooling up and the nose rises and the plane starts to lift off. Your first inclination is, what the hell's going on here? Your second realization, if you know anything about what's going on whatsoever, is that the guy didn't like the look of it. It just didn't look right. And he's decided to go back and try it again. And the connection between the two is that I would rather have the kind of pilot that looked at something and said, I didn't do a very good job on this the first time around. I don't like it. And I don't think this is going to end as well as it should. So I'm going to go around and I'm going to do it again. And if that's embarrassing to me or the airline, or costs us extra money or time or fuel, or we miss our gate or connections or whatever, I would rather have a pilot who is willing to admit that they made an error or at the very least are part of a system that has fallen into error and decided to correct it. That's the sound of somebody who cares about outcome rather than reputation. And that's really important. I happen to personally think he's right about this, but even if I didn't, even if I had a different opinion than him on this, the idea that somebody is willing to reverse themselves and say, either I was wrong then, or the situation has changed enough since then that I realize that the society is different, or at least, as it seems to me in this case, my decision at the time has led to a series of outcomes that I find much more harmful than the original harm that originally caused me to make that decision in the first place.
And in fact, Justice Thomas did indicate that the administrative state, so to speak, has become more and more powerful, and that calls for a reevaluation of this doctrine. By the way, the Baldwin case, the case that was in question here, which did not get taken up by the Supreme Court again, had to do with the fact that they filed to get a refund from the IRS of some $167,663. They filed 4 months before the deadline for getting that refund. However, the IRS says they never got it. They didn't get the application. And so that was the crux of the Baldwin case, which a lower court initially said, yeah, these people need to get their money. But then the interpretation of the IRS overturned that essentially in the eyes of an appeals court. And so the Supreme Court is basically saying, no, you're not getting your money back. What do you think, Bill, of a situation when we have more conservatives now, allegedly than ever on the Supreme Court or in a long time, and yet somehow we couldn't get 4 of those conservatives to say, yeah, we need to take a look at Brand X and Chevron again?
Well, my first thought is that there is nothing on this earth has the power to peel the scales of folly from your eyes than the Internal Revenue Service. That's my first thought. You want to talk about an agency and everything that's wrong with the idea of agency and bureaucracy. You've landed on the main vein right there. To the degree that the rest of it goes, Scott, I think this is a great subject, and it's nice to talk about something a little different for a change, because it's nice to come back to philosophy. I think that Thomas is right, but I suspect the reason that he didn't get 5 votes
Only needed four.
Or the other four, rather.
Yeah.
Sorry. The reason he didn't get the other 4 votes is because prior to you bringing this subject up, it wasn't something I was losing a whole lot of sleep over, to be honest with you. And that's not to say it's not important. That's only to say that the Supreme Court has probably the single greatest manpower. Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. It's got the biggest manpower bottleneck in the federal government. Thank God. There are only so many cases that the court can hear, and I suppose his fellow justices decided that of all the things that are out there that are important, this is not one of the ones that is important enough for our time right now. And if it turns out that the 15 years since Clarence Thomas made that decision has caused him to become not only convinced that he was in error, but this is now, in fact, a problem urgent enough to warrant the remedy of the court spending its time on it, then if he didn't win this one, then I suspect that this situation is going to get worse rather than better. And when it reaches the point where it becomes one of these things that have to be addressed, I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will take it up, and I'm hopeful and reasonably confident that when it does so, it'll have an even greater conservative majority than it does now, which means that not that the decision is going to go the way I want it to. The decision is going to go, presumably, the way that the Constitution of the United States has determined is the wisest course of action. And I have an exceedingly high amount of confidence in that document, the structure, and the people that put it together.
That new Civil Liberties Alliance that I mentioned earlier said they'll be back. They're going to continue to press this issue, and they'll find a way. They'll find cases that can work their way up so that the Supreme Court will reconsider it.
Good.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're glad that you've taken a moment to consider this program, and it is made possible by our friends, the members at BillWhittle.com, who actually pay to make sure that these messages get produced and circulated around the world. We're also grateful to our friends over at the Patriot Post. If you have not yet explored the Patriot Post, we'll provide a link in the description below. You will not regret your first visit, and I guarantee you it won't be your last visit. So go to the Patriot Post and check them out. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.